You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guests today are Gilles Duranton and Diego Puga. Gilles and Diego, welcome to Economics Detective Radio. How about you introduce yourselves so that listeners can connect a name to a voice?
Okay, so if we go by alphabetical order, let's start with me. So my name is Gilles Duranton. I was born in France many years ago. I actually met up with Diego when I was in grad school. We started working well together back then. That was about 25 years ago, and we've kept collaborating despite us moving around quite a bit. So I started my career at the London School of Economics. Then I moved to the University of Toronto, and 7 years ago, I moved to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, Diego?
Good, yeah, so my name is Diego Puga. As you mentioned, we both did our PhD together at the LSE, and we started collaborating then with moving around. So I started in Toronto, and I spent a few years at the University of Toronto. Then was in Barcelona, Madrid. And I'm currently, my permanent position is at CEMFI, which is a graduate research and teaching institution in Madrid. But this year I'm on sabbatical, so I'm actually with Gilles at Wharton as the Judith C. and William G. Bollinger visiting professor. So this is giving us a lot of time to work together and do things like finishing this paper that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so welcome both of you to the show. That paper you mentioned is Urban Growth and Its Aggregate Implications. It's a working paper right now. And unlike a lot of the papers that we've discussed on this show recently, it's a theory paper, and a particularly ambitious one. It looks at connection between cities and the growth of cities and economic growth in general, but it accounts for, many different things. A lot of economic models are very, very simplified, but this one, while still being very simplified model of the real world compared to the complexity of the real world, it accounts for things like local housing politics and traffic congestion, and of course also productivity spillovers and all sorts of things we think of as related to urban economics sort of together in a fairly comprehensive model. So how about you start by talking about some of the background for this paper? What's the state of this field studying the connection between cities and economic growth?
Yeah, so perhaps it's useful to think about how we came to write this paper. So we really started on this when we were writing a survey on existing research on the growth of cities. And of course, when you write one of the surveys, you don't want just to list papers and the results. You want to try to make some sense of it, seeing how things match together or how they do not, and things that are well covered in the literature and things that are not. So we wrote a little toy model that helped us bring together different strands of literature. And that's really the genesis, the starting point for the model in this paper. But, although, it is initially mostly a theory paper, we wanted this theory to be disciplined by numbers, disciplined by reality. So we've also tried to make it a model that, simple and transparent. That's not just like a black box, a model where you can actually see the different moving parts and how they fit together. We wanted to put some numbers into that model to try to see how it helped us explain reality. And in the process of doing that, we realized that some of the numbers we needed to put in the model were available already, but some were not. So we also needed to develop some empirical work to try to get some of those numbers in. So in the end, the paper that started really most as a theory paper has some theory, but also has empirics, and then has a quantitative part in the end. And this is partly what's made it so complex. And in terms of the different components that go into it, and this starting point of coming from a survey, thinking of what's in the literature, what's not, We realize that some aspects of cities and their growth we understand quite well, and that has mostly to do with the advantages of city, the benefits that we get by being in a denser environment, in a bigger environment where there's more people around us, and how that makes firms and workers more productive. But we also realized there were two other components of cities that we didn't quite understand that well. One of those missing components, or less well understood components, is about the cost side of cities. As we got more people into cities, not only productivity increases, but also congestion increases, the cost of housing increases, lots of bad things happen as well. And we had a much less accurate sense, first of the magnitude of those things, but also of how we should model them. And the second aspect that was really missing was a way to think about what determines the size of cities in this balance between the good things of bigger cities and the bad things of bigger cities. What determines where we stop? How many more people can come into a city? And we started here, very much in line with literature, thinking that, maybe the size of cities was whatever was efficient. But then realized if we went along that route, we really couldn't capture the way things worked in reality. And in particular, we saw that if we let cities be efficient, then in reaction to positive shocks, to things that really provide a benefit for cities, we should see many more people coming in and much more housing being built than we see in reality. So this led us to try to build the second component, that's sort of new part of the model, which is this political process where we model the size of cities as a tension between incumbent residents who are already living in a city, maybe have a house there already, and people who are trying to get in from the outside. And that tension is really fundamental to establish this growth of cities, the extent to which it proceeds, and what are the benefits and costs of that. So that's really a bit background of how we came to this.
Mm-hmm. Gilles, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, if I step back a little bit more, the urban economics as a field was revived nearly 30 years ago by a bunch of classic papers. One of them was a paper by Ed Glaser, Andre Schleifer, and two other co-authors called Growth in Cities, which essentially put urban economics on the map by saying cities are about economic growth. And it was also around the same time that Bob Lucas and Paul Romer were developing endogenous growth theory, and Bob Lucas was saying, my theory relies on human capital externalities, and if you want to have a look at those effects, you should actually be able to look at them in cities. This is where I think they actually happen. And that basically raised the possibility that not only urbanization was something that was happening as we get richer and people moving to cities as they move out of agriculture, but also the fact that cities themselves could be part of the growth process, could be responsible for some of our prosperity. Associated with that is many of us working for many years on those benefits of cities and getting lots of results. At the same time, those results were a bit ambivalent because we were saying, we have agglomeration effects, but they're kind of small. And, if you have agglomeration effects everywhere and you try to reallocate people, maybe that's going to be a wash because by growing one place, you're going to make another place decline and they're going to lose those agglomeration effects and the others are going to gain some. So we were not very clear about, the aggregate implications of cities and what actually cities do to the big macroeconomic quantities, income, rate of growth, and so on and so forth. So then to explore that sort of question, it's really hard because, you need lots of cities and lots of countries if you want to do something purely empirical. But, people have tried to do some cross-sectional work using data from different countries, but that's not been particularly well successful. Those cross-country growth regressions will suffer from lots and lots of problems. So here instead we said, okay, given that nothing purely empirical will work, let's actually substitute the lack of good data by actually some theory, some modeling, but also making sure that this modeling would be sound. So trying to also restrain this modeling to the bare necessities, to what we knew was really, really important in cities, i.e. this notion of agglomeration effects and this notion of urban costs.
Mm-hmm. So just to be clear for the audience, agglomeration effects are when you have a bunch of people in one place, they have positive spillovers on one another and they're more productive. So you can think of Silicon Valley as the classic example, that a lot of people who are very productive in Silicon Valley would be very unproductive if you stuck them in the middle of Iowa or some sparsely populated place. They get a benefit from having lots of programmers in one place, or many other professions as well.
Yes, that's basically the notion that the sum is worth more, the whole is worth more than the sum of the parts.
Mm-hmm. But if that were the whole story, we might expect that all of planet Earth would, all of humanity would live in one giant mega city, and of course that's not what we see. So your model has other factors as well that can kind of explain, why we have the distribution of city sizes we do have. Do you want to talk about the sort of empirical regularities you're trying to explain with this model?
Yeah, so one of them is, again, because we wanted our model to be not only disciplined by data, but also to be able to replicate what we thought or what we think are really core facts that a model of that kind should address. So one of them is indeed the size distribution of cities. So when you look, and it's something that's been known for many years, since the early part of the 20th century, with some work by a guy called Zipf in the middle of the 20th century. So this is the notion that the size distribution of cities essentially follows a Pareto distribution with slope with a shape parameter -1. So that's a very technical word. So what does that mean in practice? So it means that the expected size of the second largest city is about half, or is half the size of the largest. The expected size of the third largest is about a third, and so on and so forth. So when you look at the US, New York is about 20 plus million as a metropolitan area. Los Angeles is a bit too big. It's 15 instead of 10. But then Chicago, whatever, 7 or 8 is about the right size, and so on and so forth. And this is something that we're not taking literally, but this is the sort of size distribution that we wanted to be able to replicate. So in order to do that, we have a process where cities are heterogeneous. So basically, some cities are going to be more productive than others, and the cities that are more productive will want to be bigger. We'll explain that in a second. Will want to be bigger within equilibrium. At the same time, we know that cities are not always the largest or the second largest. So New York has been at the top for very long, but like for instance, in the last 50 years, in the top 10, Detroit went from pretty high up in the top 10 to pretty far down, and now out of the top 10. We've seen the rise of places like Phoenix, like Dallas, like Houston. So something that would also be consistent with that. So what we assume here is that cities suffer from small productivity shocks, and there'll be some lucky cities that over time will get very productive, some unlucky cities that over time will become very unproductive, and with our model actually will not be populated.
Yeah. There's been a lot of sort of churn in the size of different cities. Another guest, Kevin Erdman, called it a refugee wave, but nobody really noticed it because it was within the same country. And we tend to notice, we notice when a bunch of people leave Syria, but we don't necessarily notice when a bunch of people move out of California and coastal California and go to Phoenix. He attributed that mostly, and this might be jumping ahead a little, to the elasticity of the housing markets in those different cities, which I know is a part of your model and is actually endogenously determined in your model. Do you want to discuss how that comes in?
I think it's partly the fact that people move around, but it's all within the same country, so it's not as spectacular. But also partly because these ups and downs take place relative to some common trend, where yes, over a short period of time, cities might decline, but this doesn't last very long. Partly because there's already infrastructure and streets and things in place in those cities, so they're not going to totally disappear, but also because this shocks sometimes are positive, sometimes are negative. So it's very rare that a city just keeps getting hit by negative shocks one after another, right? So that's also a component of the model. We have these ups and downs for individual cities, but this happens with a growth process in the background, where actually technology is evolving everywhere, and we're getting innovations, and that's helping the economy grow everywhere. We're also getting human capital accumulation. People are getting more educated. We're learning more about technologies, developing more stuff, and that's also leading to some growth. So, in fact, we were talking before about Detroit and how it lost population. But, in essence, if you look at metropolitan areas in the US, there's no metropolitan area that shrunk between, say, 1980 and 2010, right? They all increased. Some increased by very little. Some increased population by a lot. But I think that's also something that makes us not pay as much attention to this. The fact that it's relative ups and downs, but in the background, there's this common growth process that's actually fairly strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Detroit is the strongest case for negative economic shock being the cause of depopulation. Whereas when people when people move out of San Francisco Bay Area, it's not because the San Francisco Bay Area is unproductive. It's because the housing costs are just so high, and of course that's some people are moving in to work there, and then mostly low income people are moving out to escape high costs.
So in that case, we can start talking about what we think about city size in our model and how we think about that.
Mm-hmm.
So you have indeed places like San Francisco, New York, which are extremely highly productive. In both, some cities will be like this in our model and in reality. And given this inverse U shape where you have this trade-off between, again, those agglomeration effects, the merrier and the more productive we are, and those urban costs associated in our model with two different things. The fact that as the city grows in population, people need to move on average from further away in order to get to work in the morning as the city physically expands. And also because as the city gets denser, you also get more congestion in traffic, and that travel to work is also getting slower. Is also getting slower. So we have here two key parameters, which means that there will be some happy size for the city, and then above that size, things will start to decline. So the people in the city, in our very simplified world, they see that if people keep coming after this happy size, things are going to get worse for them because indeed because traffic conditions, because the cost of housing and all of that. So it's natural to think that they may want to be close to that maximum point for them. And again, when you go around and ask people about their place, including very prosperous places like Boston, they say, "Oh, we're perfectly fine the way we are. Why do we need another million people? We don't." And then by imposing all sorts of land use regulations, being restrictive on that front, they basically prevent new housing from being built. And if new housing is not built, the population cannot increase or cannot so in our model, we cannot increase at all. In the real world, cannot increase well very much. An incredibly well prosperous place like San Francisco has been historically growing by less than 1% a year. Typically, in absence of those barriers, in America, cities that are prosperous and do very, very well, they would grow in population by 5 to 6% a year. So it means that those regulations clearly have a really, really strong effect. And this is, for the people who live in those cities, this is justified by the fact that they actually want to be at the top of that curve where they can actually maximize their well-being. So you're going to tell me, oh, but then if everybody's maximizing their well-being, everything's going to be fine. And the answer is no, and the answer is no for a subtle reason. It's because you have different cities of different productivity. So the optimal size of the most productive city will be large. The privately optimal size of the second most productive city will be slightly less large, and so on and so forth. But the optimum of whatever the 200th most productive city will be much, much smaller, and this optimum will also be not that high. So it means that it would be efficient socially to actually get New York to grow, so that actually the newcomers to New York, yes, they would have a slightly negative effect on the others and increase congestion slightly, but at the same time, they would be coming from a place which is discretely much less productive. So by getting those guys to move, you would actually improve national output. You would actually improve the consumption at the country level. You would improve national welfare, but you see that you have this tension between the private interests of the incumbents and welfare in the broader world economy. And in our model, the two don't get together very well, which we think is a really key important issue within the real world, where lots of people would like to move to New York, would like to move to San Francisco, but the residents of those places have essentially made it impossible to do so unless you pay a very, very large amount of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to sort of reiterate what you're saying, there's an optimal city size from the perspective of the incumbents in that city. And when you're below that optimal size, more people coming in benefits the newcomers, of course, and also the incumbents. But then when you reach that optimum size and go beyond it, the newcomers get more than 100% of the benefit, and the incumbents are actually worse off with each newcomer. Although overall, if we consider the welfare of everyone, both incumbents and newcomers, people, there's an overall benefit. So a potential for, newcomers to maybe compensate existing people in order to grow beyond their preferred city size, but that hasn't borne out in real life politics so far.
Yeah, essentially, they're making different comparisons, right? I mean, someone moving from Kansas City to San Francisco is comparing the well-being in Kansas City with the size it had before they move, with the size that San Francisco gets once they move. Whereas the person in San Francisco is comparing the well-being in San Francisco before this person moved and after this person moved. And this person brings in some additional agglomeration benefits, but also brings some congestion. And if we already are at the point where the two balance out, then any further increase is going to bring more congestion than agglomeration economy. So from the point of view of people who are already there, they say, okay, I don't want this extra person to come in. But the person who's coming in is not making that comparison, is not thinking about San Francisco yesterday, but San Francisco today when I'm added into the mix. He's thinking about, Kansas City yesterday versus San Francisco today, and that's a big gain for them, right? So that's the source of attention, really.
Yeah, and your model does not consider the difference between homeowners versus renters. That's maybe it's abstracted past that, but one might think that if you own your home, you have different incentives than if you don't, because of course rising housing costs for you increase the value of your of your most valuable asset, whereas rising housing costs for a renter is just pure cost. But yeah, I mean, many things are abstracted out of the model, like exactly how local politics works, how people, how your local government is elected, what are the political coalitions. But what I like about it is it shows this tension between incumbents and newcomers that I think explains so much of urban politics and NIMBYism and why these land use restrictions are so prevalent when they seem to be so economically unproductive.
Yeah, this is exactly right. And this is an important point about what you want to do or what you can do when you're indulging into a modeling exercise is, we cannot micro-model absolutely everything, because as you start getting into finer details, then those details start becoming more different across different places, and they get really hard to model. So we try to model this tension between the incumbent occupants and the newcomers, or the potential newcomers to those highly productive places, in the simplest possible way, where basically the incumbents can erect essentially a barrier and make the others pay for that, to cross that barrier. In reality, indeed, there's an asset market which is pretty complicated, but trying to model a dynamic asset market, given that our cities are different, suffer from all sorts of shocks and stuff, would have been overwhelming. So we try to model that in a simple way, being completely aware that indeed there's more to the story, including especially with an asset market, which means that it's indeed really, really hard to get back to a situation where those cities would be more permissive, because in our model you could try to bribe them for the current period. In real life, the problem is that once you've paid 2 or 3 million for your small and not very nice bungalow at the heart of Silicon Valley, the last thing you want is a place to become incredibly permissive in terms of new building, in terms of new housing supply, because then the value of your 2 or 3 million bungalow collapses to 500,000 or less. So then it means that those things, indeed, so this is something that's missing to our model, but in the real world, there's also those effects get entrenched through the asset market and the debts that people pay.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about traffic. That's one of your costs in your of a growing city in your model. You model as there being sort of a commuting cost that's not exactly proportional to the distance from the city center. Do you want to explain how commuting and congestion sort of play into your model?
Yeah, in fact, besides the political process that we've been talking about before, this is the other ingredient of the model that was most difficult to model, because there's a tendency when you write these urban models to simply think of there should be a cost to bigger cities, but not to worry too much about how that cost exactly is modeled. And if you just want to get qualitative results, that's fine. But if, as in our paper, you want to get quantitative results and make sense of the numbers and the magnitudes that you see in the real world, then details become important. So this is the aspect of the model where we've been going more back and forth between the modeling and the numbers, and back to the modeling and back to the numbers, until we've got something that we think captures the bare minimum that you need to really be able to match reality. So it's a process of commuting in the city that has 3 key parameters, and we think those are the 3 that are really needed. The first is something that describes how your daily commuting distance changes depending on where you live. So, of course, as the city grows, people start, moving, living in places that tend to be further and further away for what you could think of as the city center. But the tradition in urban economics modeling is to think about monocentric cities where everyone is commuting to the center and back, but that's not the way real cities work. In real life cities, not everyone is going to work in the center and then going back home. People travel to different places. They often live in the suburbs, but maybe work in another place in the suburbs. They also travel for all sorts of different reasons, not just to commute to work, but to shop and to do all sorts of things, right? So in reality, as you live further away from the center, sure, you have to travel greater distances, but the relationship is not one-to-one. In fact, the elasticity of how much you travel with respect to how far you live from the center, it's closer to like 0.08, something like that, right? So you double the distance and you only increase your driving by about 8%. So that's the first aspect that we wanted to get in there, and that's our starting point. But then, fine. So people, as they live further away from the center, they need to cover greater distance in their car and public transport or whatever means of transportation they're using. But then the second issue is how long that's going to take. And in how long that's going to take, that has two components. One component is that there's congestion. And as you get more people in the city, travel is also going to slow down. So that's the second aspect. The speed of travel over a given distance at any point in time is going to be slower in places that are denser. And that's the second parameter that we get into our model. The third one is one that's needed mainly because of this dynamic aspect. We're thinking about how the economy evolves over time. And that's a parameter that, once you figure out how long you need to drive, once you figure out how much time it takes, then you need to figure out how costly you feel that is. That time that you're spending in traffic, you're spending on a bus, how costly is that for you? And that depends partly on technology and things like, highways and public transportation. But it also depends on, what value you assign to your time. And of course, as the economy grows and people become wealthier, they also assign a higher dollar value to the time they spend stuck in traffic. And that we realized early on was a really important component. If you want to make sense of how much city grows as GDP per capita is growing in the economy, you really need to take this rising cost of time into consideration. Otherwise, cities would be growing much faster than they do. And they don't, because this cost of travel is really also increasing as we become wealthier as a society. So those are the three aspects that we brought in there. And then, starting from those aspects, we actually build a model and we try to estimate those parameters that we've been describing. And perhaps the most important of them all is the first one. So the model gives us a way to estimate that parameter early on just by taking that equation. So since we say, well, this is a parameter about how far people drive depending on where they live, we can take data for the US of how long people drive, where they live relative to the city center, and compute that elasticity. So that's one way to get that parameter. And this gives us this 0.08 elasticity that I mentioned before. You double a distance to the city center, and you increase your driving distance by about 8%. But the model, as we start from our initial assumptions and we start deriving the equilibrium of the model, gets more and more aggregate, right? So at some point we try to putting in these benefits of cities coming from this agglomeration, from these spillovers that make people more productive. But at the same time, the greater housing costs and traffic and congestion being the downside. Then we try to determine this equilibrium city size within the city, resulting from this tension between incumbents and newcomers. And that gives us within city equilibrium. Well, the key equation there also gives us another way to estimate that very same parameter. And that's an estimation that instead comes from thinking about what is the gradient of house prices within the city. Since accessibility is important to people, and accessibility is greater if you live in a relatively central place, then houses will, of course, be more expensive in more central places, typically adjusting, for composition of neighborhoods and for school quality and for other stuff. So looking at those house gradients within cities gives us a second way to get at the same parameter. And the surprising thing is once we do that calculation, we get exactly the same number. But we don't stop there. We actually go to even a more aggregated level of the model. We can then look at the equilibrium not inside one city, but across all cities in the model. A situation where people have looked at the benefits and costs of different cities. They've looked at these regulatory barriers that incumbents are creating in their different cities, and they decide where they want to live. And once they've done that, we see the equilibrium size of different cities. And now we can compare overall cost of living in a city with the size of the city. And as we do that, we get another way to estimate the same parameter. And again, we get exactly the same number, which was one of the nice surprises of this exercise because it gave us confidence not just on this magnitude of urban cost, but also in the way the model works. Because as we aggregate up and solve the model, we still get the same magnitude coming from different equations and coming from very different sources of data, then that gives us quite some confidence in the sort of magnitude that we're finding.
Mm-hmm. It would be a big problem if you plugged in different numbers and got radically different answers. It would point to some kind of inconsistency in the underlying model. But it's good that it was aligned, and kind of adds more strength to the idea that this model is really capturing what's happening with commuting costs and congestion. So getting to the sort of the outputs of the model, your paper has a few different counterfactuals that you apply to the model, which is the main benefit of having a model like this is we can look at things outside of what has actually occurred and say, okay, what if, given the parameters of this model, what if we changed one thing? My favorite part of the paper is where you go through the counterfactual, where land use restrictions and planning regulations are completely lifted, and you look at the change in size in population of the various cities and the rural areas. Do you want to talk through that counterfactual, how it works, and what its results are?
So when we, in inverted commas, play with the model at the end, we do it indeed for a number of reasons. The first one is indeed to try to develop a sense of how cities actually matter in terms of macroeconomics, and be able also to answer more detailed questions about, like the one you just raised. At the same time, this particular one, there are two ways of thinking about it. The first one is we start thinking about getting even more restrictive, because you have people out there who say, oh, those places are way too big and they should be smaller, and so on and so forth. So in that case, we do some, let's say, local experiments where we allow for we only allow for New York and Los Angeles to be as big as Chicago, for instance, and we already see some reasonably large effects. One complication here is that when you want to kick people out, fictitious people out of our cities in the model, you need to know where they're going to go. So they're going to go into cities as we have them, but they're also going to go into cities that don't exist. So we also need to develop a device to think about those cities that don't exist in the current well configuration, but would exist under some counterfactual. So here we still rely on the flow and the fact that the size distribution well of cities follows some patterns, and we basically, in order to know about those cities that don't exist in the current situation, we basically extrapolate from the flow, which means that actually one of the key effects, if you kick people out of Los Angeles and New York, that's going to hurt some of the people who remain, because they're going to lose some agglomeration effects, and the loss of those agglomeration effects is going to be larger than the savings they're going to make on housing cost and congestion. But beyond that, the big losers are going to be those that get literally well kicked out, because they're going to end up either in rural areas that are going to grow, and rural areas will operate under well decreasing returns, or they're going to end up in cities that they would like to move to other cities, but those cities are already at their maximum, so they're not going well to take them, and they will have to go down well to places that currently are so unproductive, making them unviable as cities. But in this world with more people, they're going to become viable as well as cities, albeit very unproductive. So here we started finding large effects. Then indeed the natural follow-up on those experiments is to try to think about some counterfactuals that are more and more drastic. And the more drastic one is, okay, what if we actually let people flow more freely? So a complication here is that the movements of population based on the parameters that we estimate are actually very significant indeed. We're talking about a place like New York becoming vastly bigger than it currently is. So that's starting to beg some questions about how far out of the current situation we can extrapolate given what we know. And indeed, the fact that we estimate some parameters for urban cost, but those parameters for urban cost, we estimate them for American metropolitan areas whose population is between 100,000 and 20 million. We have no idea what's going to happen in a city of 40 or 50 million. And things may actually turn out to be quite different, because when you look at the world around us, even if you look really, really far, even the Shanghais and Tokyos and Jakartas of the world, I'm not sure, they may have like 30 million people, depending exactly on how you define and how you count them. But we're not seeing extremely, extremely large cities. So here we need to put some bounds to the exercise, because, for instance, it's not quite clear that having a New York City of 200 million would actually make much sense, and would lead to urban costs as we have them in our model. It's not quite clear. The urban costs may get much, much worse. They may not extrapolate well directly from what we've estimated in the data to those extremes. So that's raising some interesting questions here. So we decided in terms of modeling strategy to actually cap the size of the very largest cities to 30 or 40 million, so that they don't gobble the entire world economy, because indeed we know that, or we expect as cities grow very large indeed, that there might be some other things beyond, or that the parameters we estimate may actually change.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing in those counterfactuals are just just how the numbers change. You say that the income gains of capping New York City at 40 million, doubling its size would be 25.7%, according to the model, is the income gain overall on average. But to incumbent New Yorkers, they would actually be worse off, even though the whole country would be richer. Your typical New Yorker would be, I think, 13% worse off. And 40 million is arbitrary, but you point out that at 30 and 50 million, it's very a very similar estimate. It's just an overall gain, a very large overall gain, and somewhat of a loss to the people who currently live in the biggest cities.
So it's exactly what you say, knowing that there are some caveats to that sort of exercise. That's a very long run exercise. Like, even if we let people build freely in San Francisco, in New York, and so on and so forth, the rate of growth of those places, they're not going to double in size well overnight, or treble in size well overnight. It's going to take many, many years. There are lots of things we abstract from. Again, when a city grows very fast, it's raising all sorts of challenges in terms of urban infrastructure that we're not taking into account, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, we're seeing that beyond the exact numbers, it's saying that because actually places have very different well productivities, preventing people from moving from the less productive places to the more productive places can have very large costs indeed, over and beyond just this trade-off between agglomeration effects on urban costs. So that's something really important. And what also this type of exercise allows us to do is indeed to show with some numbers all the key conflicts that we talked about earlier, about the incumbents, about the potential newcomers, and so on and so forth, so that we can actually will illustrate those costs and benefits with some numbers, as opposed to remain just some abstract quantities.
That's right, and that comes back to what we discussed in the beginning, in the sense that writing this model, we wanted to keep the model as simple as possible within the necessary complexity, of course, so that it was transparent in terms of mechanisms. And one of the things that this allows us to do is then, when we get to the stage of doing these counterfactual exercises, to see really where the effects are coming from. So not just to come up with some number and say, well, this is how much consumption per person in the US would increase overall, but actually to see the magnitude of the different effects and see where it's coming from, right? So of course, when we do this sort of exercise, we find gains, and we find gains because First of all, there are some people who really don't experience much change. I mean, even if these bigger productive cities relax their planning regulations, there will be all sorts of other places that wouldn't change their population much. So people who are already there, they really wouldn't see much change. People who are already incumbents in these big cities like New York and San Francisco and Boston and so on will experience some losses. But what the model is telling us is that because they're already setting these regulatory barriers to balance off the good side of more population against the bad side of more population for themselves, then the two things are very close to balancing out. So even if you make substantial changes, the difference for them is not going to be huge, right? So in the exercise you were mentioning of removing this planning regulations completely, well, sure, people in New York might lose that 13%. Once we get down to Boston, we see that the losses there are only about 1%, right? So they're there. They explain why people who are already living there don't want to make it easier for others to build and live in the cities. But the losses for them are actually not huge. The really big changes actually come from the people who right now cannot live in those cities because they're prohibitively expensive because of regulation. And absent those regulatory barriers, would be able to move in at a reasonable cost. And for them, the big gain would be not just in terms of the agglomeration economies, but would be also in terms of how productive the cities are relative to where they are currently forced to live because of the high cost of living in Palo Alto or in other places, right? So that's more than the exact percent. I think what we're getting from this exercise is the relative magnitudes about where are the big gains, where are the small gains, and why overall it might be good for society to let these bigger cities grow at least a bit more than the current size.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, do either of you have any closing thoughts, any kind of broad takeaways that someone who's listened to this conversation should come away from it with?
I think we've covered the main point. As I think it's clear what we wanted to do here. I know, and then the paper came out as a working paper only a few weeks ago, and the reaction has been focused a lot on these specific numbers. I think I would like people to take more than the actual numbers and to think about whether the gains for society, whether they're 30 or 35 or 40% or whatever. It's more about understanding this process and understanding what's taking us there and how we can move on, right? So that's really more the purpose of the paper rather than really focusing on one number or another, where we're first of all thinking of a very long run exercise, as you were saying, and then second is subject to all of these caveats about how you move on from the current situation to this hypothetical situation where we might have more lenient regulation.
Mm-hmm. All right. And with that, we'll end our conversation. Gilles and Diego, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been very nice talking to you.